Welcome to In the Open with Luke and Joe. I'm your host, Luke Shantz, and here's my co-host, Joe Seppi, and a big welcome to our special guest, IBM fellow, Chris Ferris. Before we get to our show, don't forget to like and subscribe.
Thank you for joining us. Today, we are pleased to bring you a conversation with IBM fellow and CTO of open source technology, Chris Ferris. We're going to be discussing a variety of open source projects, as well as a recent report, The Value of Open Source in the Cloud Era. This report surveyed 3,400 developers and managers to build an understanding of the attitudes and realities in today's development ecosystem. Before we welcome our guest, Chris Ferris, let's say hello to my colleague and co-host, Joe Seppi.
Hey, Luke. How are you?
Good. How are you doing, Joe?
I'm okay, thank you. It's a little overcast today. The weather's been a little weird. Like the other day, it was warm through the night and then slowly got colder through the day, which is always really weird. Like it's flipped around. The weather's been really strange. How about you, Luke?
Similar, but I think you want to be at your pool, whereas I want to stay out of the sun at all costs. So this is perfect. I like a warm-ish day and then a cool night. That's great for me.
No, it sounds nice. And look, I have a whole closet full of light coats, light jackets that I like to wear. So I prefer a good cool day. So it's nice. I'm enjoying it.
It's funny you mentioned. I remember that about when we would do events together in New York City. You always had very cool jackets. But before we welcome Chris, I wanted to mention a few things, just a little bit of housekeeping. So throughout our session today, if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop those into the chat on whatever platform you're watching. Happy to do that. And if you're catching this as a replay later as a podcast, hey, tweet at us. Happy to answer questions post event. No problem. I also wanted to mention, as always, you can find us at ibm.biz in the open. We have the live stream whenever we're going live every other week is on there, as well as all past episodes. And then if you want to find the podcasts, you can find all our past episodes as podcasts here. And I don't want to forget all the rest of the podcast ecosystem. We've got other podcasts, IBM Z DevOps Talks. We have a data science podcast. We have, IBM Cloud podcast, Call for Code podcast. There's so many podcasts on IBM Developer. So make sure to check those out. But without further ado, let's welcome our guest, Chris Ferris.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Good. How are you, Chris? Welcome.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. And speaking of overcast, I'm just going to warn you, it's like, I live in Florida, so it's the rainy season, which means it's going to rain every day for the next 3 months. And
3 months, huh?
Sure enough, it was beautiful this morning, and now it's a huge thunderhead right overhead. So
yeah, I feel like I told the story maybe on the show once already, but like I was in Florida once, and my flight got canceled home. I was there with my wife and son, and we ended up going to the Kennedy Space Center and enjoying the day that we were gifted by the airport snafus and stuff. But anyway, I'm trying to work while my wife is driving, and it starts pouring like crazy, which apparently it does in Florida. And I put in, Orlando Airport and, put it up on the screen. Okay, great. And we start driving and I'm working and we pull into this tiny airport in Orlando. Apparently Orlando has like 3 or 4.
Oh, there's like an executive one. Yeah.
And so we're like, this is not the right airport. Anyway, yeah, Florida rain is crazy. Good luck with that all summer, huh?
All summer. But I mean, it's actually my wife showed me a cartoon the other day, and it's so it starts out. It's 2:30 a.m. and it's beautiful out, right? 3 o'clock, and then it's got this picture of the palm trees are just blowing and it's raining like hell, and then 3:15. That's about it. Usually it's in the afternoon. Usually it's like mid-afternoon when the thunder showers come rolling through. Come from the West Coast across to the east, and nails every afternoon. But then it's usually beautiful in the evenings, and you go out and dine out by the water. It's
that sounds nice.
It's a tough life, but somebody's got to do it. So
I had the flip scenario when I lived in Olympia, Washington, out in the Pacific Northwest, where it's beautiful in the summer, but all the non-summer months, it just rains all the time. But when it's summer and it's nice out, you just really soak it in. It's lovely.
Yeah. Plus, in Florida, you learn you have to do everything before about 10:30 a.m. because it doesn't get as hot as else. I think out in the Northwest, it's going to get hotter than here. It's like 90 degrees is usually about as hot as it gets, but it's humid.
Yeah,
it's not a dry heat like some places.
Yeah,
so, if you're out playing tennis or golf or something, it can be brutal.
Yeah, I can imagine. Cool. Well, hey, you've been here at IBM for a while. Maybe we could start. You could just tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and how it started, and kind of your little bit of your IBM story, I guess.
Sure. So I actually am a professional hire into IBM. I joined in 2002, so I'm working on my 20th year right now. Before that, I was working at Sun Microsystems for, I don't know, about 13 years, I think. I had actually started to work in open source and around XML in particular, and some of the XML parsers starting to use open source and contribute back. And I started getting involved in a project called EBXML, which was a sort of a joint initiative between an organization called OASIS, the Organization for the Advancement of Structured Information Systems, and the UN. And they were working on sort of trying to unify the world of e-business and enabling it to be done through XML. And so I had been working on in Sun's IT organization for a long time. And then I joined JavaSoft, and they said, "Hey, you should, you have this background in e-business and systems and so forth. You should get involved in this." And so I did. And one of the co-leads for the organization was my boss, and the other one was Bob Sutor, who is now over in research in the quantum group. I guess he saw something he liked, and he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And the next thing I knew, I was working for him.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, to hear 20 years for you. I feel like a baby at 5, and which is interesting. My career usually was 2 or 3 years at a place, and I'd, be moving on to the next thing. But I'm happy here for a variety of reasons we could go into another time. But it's amazing, especially I used to live in Westchester. I'm over in Connecticut now, but like I couldn't throw a stick without hitting an IBMer, and most of them are, multi-decade IBM.
I grew up in Westchester. I grew up in Rye.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I have some friends over at Rye.
IBM right up the street there.
Yeah.
IBM. We had a timeshare in the high school. And that was where they taught. The 8th grade had an honors course in computer programming, and so actually I took that one. That was a lot of fun. That was probably my first introduction to writing software. It was writing checkers and chess, and various other, poker and so forth on the man. That was a lot of fun. But yeah. I was basically hired to go and work in the open technology organization, and I've been here ever since. So this has been the only job I've had at IBM. I mean, I've been promoted a few times, but they brought me in to try and help open up IBM, get it more involved in open standards and open source, and here we are, 20 years later.
Yeah. That's amazing. I love that this is like a 20-year story in open tech and open source and stuff, which really is a good segue into, perhaps the first thing we can chat about, like IBM's open source story, I guess you'd say.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people would, sort of say IBM open source, really? Until we acquired Red Hat, I think it wasn't as widely known as it probably should have been, just how involved and invested in open source we have been since the earliest days, since before Red Hat was a thing, we were involved in open source and working on, working in contributing to the Linux kernel, in helping to write some of the software that's powering the web today. Right, we had some people working in the very earliest days on the Apache web server and so forth.
And I think, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Chris. I just wanted to say too that, like, I think it's important to point out too that it's like open source, but also like open standards work, and like open governance too. Yep. You know, I to concur with you, like, often found myself frustrated working in open source and feeling like nobody realized IBM did as much as we do in open source. Yeah. But I often would experience where, like, you know, in a lot of the organizations I was in, there would be like a limit for an employer to be a part of the TSC or the committee or whatever. And we were always bumping up against that limit. Like, oh, you got to step down so this other person can come on. You know, it's like we do too much open source. It almost felt like.
Well, I mean, and that's the reality. I mean, so we've been doing it for the longest time. You know, actually, if you reach back, you know, in the very earliest days, in like the late 1990s, when Linux was starting to get a little popular, and a certain operating system vendor in the upper Northwest there started getting a little antsy about their hegemony over the operating system on the desktop and the server, and IBM indemnified its clients if they were using Linux on IBM hardware. We said, go for it. We got your back, right? And that really sort of helped to legitimize open source for the enterprise. I mean, you know, there are a lot of financial institutions that started, you know, they were all rolling their own distros and so forth, and starting to leverage a lot of open source, whether it was just the, you know, like the new compilers and stuff like that, or, you know, just the plethora of things that were growing up around that ecosystem, and we sort of made that a legitimate thing, right? And then, of course, you know, we helped to found the Apache Software Foundation. It was our legal department actually was the ones that helped to write the original Apache software license with others. I mean, you know, we collaborated with others in the industry, obviously, but we helped to bring that to life. And I think, I'm not sure, I don't know if we have anybody on the board now, but for the longest time, we had somebody who was serving on the board. We have a number of mentors there. We have people that are working to this day in various of the Apache projects. You know, we helped to establish Eclipse, and now that was one of those situations where actually I was at Sun at the time, and it was an interesting development. You know, to come up, Eclipse, what does this mean? And I said, take a what do you think it means? But you know, you look at these communities, whether it's Eclipse, the Linux Foundation, or Apache. And they all started with like one thing, right? So Linux, it was the kernel. With Eclipse, it was the IDE framework for Java. And with Apache, it was HTTP. And now they each have, you know, over 300 or 400 projects a piece, you know, working on all kinds of things that have nothing to do with the original purpose. And it was for exactly that point that you made about open governance, is because it basically created these sort of safe spaces to innovate and collaborate, even with your fiercest frenemies, right? You know, I mean, you know, it's amazing to this day that, you know, we have, you know, collaborations with, you know, in the cloud space with every one of the hyperscaler cloud vendors, right? And the activities that we do, and whether it's in CNCF for Kubernetes and so forth, very, very collaborative environment. There's no, you know, sort of backstabbing and kind of stuff. Standards was a little bit different. Standards was a little bit more defensive, but I find that open source tends to be a lot more collaborative and innovative, and sharing of success.
Yeah. Sorry, I think I'm getting an echo there. the whole vendor neutral governance thing.
Maybe turn your volume down. Not sure. I was also going to mention, I think it was Brad Topol on a past episode mentioned when the folks who developed Eclipse found out it was being open sourced, it was a bit of a paradigm shift because they thought, they're like, oh boy, this is, we spent all this time, we thought this is a product, and what are you giving us away? But obviously, it, like you mentioned, it has implications, and it grows bigger than it could ever be standing on its own.
Right. Totally. That's exactly right. And it's still to this day. I mean, still we're encountering situations where, I'm making a recommendation that we open source something, and they're like, what? We spent all this, resource in developing it, and it's proprietary, and it's earning us money. I'm like, you don't need to have proprietary software to make money. Ask the guys that we just bought for $34 billion. Everything they do is open source, and they're still making a ton of money. So,
and it's interesting. You had mentioned that other operating system from the past that was apprehensive against Linux, and I believe on the last version of it, they even started to incorporate the Linux kernel into it, and then made a PowerShell for the for Linux. So it's interesting how the paradigm shifts change over the decades.
Totally, and then like VS Code is one of the most popular IDEs out there, right? But almost everybody does it to develop on Linux, right? I mean, that's the reality.
So funny. How's your audio, Joe? I don't know if he's there yet.
I think maybe he lost his audio, or
I think he might have. So,
okay,
we'll just move on, and Joe will join up with us in a little bit. So, something that I know we had that this ties into excellent is there was a study, because I think we all had a feeling and kind of had like a folk sense of like, this is how open source works. There is a value, and it's right, but there's some confirmation on this now, right? There was a recent study, the value of open source in the cloud era. That's
right. Yeah. So it was actually interesting. I'd been reading an article that was suggesting that, if you're a software developer in the cloud, that you need to know these 10 APIs from, and I won't mention the cloud provider. And I said to myself, well, that's just not right. I said, because everything that's behind each one of those APIs is open source, right? And I said, I think it's actually the case that developers, I think their preference would be to have skills in the underlying open source capabilities, rather than the proprietary vendors' set of APIs. And so I got with the IBM marketing team and said, is there any way we can do can we do a survey, a study about, just what is the developer sentiment around, whether it's, for cloud and for, various other data and AI capabilities. What's their preference in terms of what APIs and what technologies are they interested in to advance their careers? And it was interesting because, my sense was, no, it's the open source that they care about. It's not necessarily the proprietary APIs. That comes secondary. But I mean, if you're doing container orchestration, you're using Kubernetes, whether it says so or not, that's what's under the covers there. And, and that's the skill set that developers are looking to acquire. And that's the one that I think that actually hiring managers are looking to find for their teams, because it's easy enough to learn, the skin that various vendors put on top of that. But so that they, we studied, we did a study with O'Reilly, and they surveyed about 3,400 plus, and probably evenly split between hiring manager types and developer types, across, the spectrum of enterprise sizes and so forth. And the study came back and reinforced my sense that actually 2/3 of developers felt that it was the underlying open source APIs and skill sets that helped advance their careers. And the other interesting sort of tidbit from that was that over 50% felt that their contributions to open source actually helped advance their careers, and essentially netted them more money in the jobs that they did land. So that was, I think, a very positive thing. I mean, there was a huge, there was a number of different findings, and I think, there's the link to the report there. A huge amount of information in there, but it all sort of reinforced my sense that the things that matter are the skills in the underlying open source, not so much the proprietary APIs.
That's excellent. And, it is good to get that confirmation, because I feel like, especially on this show and just in general, that has been, I think, the message that I've been purporting to folks is like, hey, get involved in open source. It's a way for you to not only differentiate yourself at your company, but then also get to know that greater ecosystem.
That's right.
And if you want to make a move, or if you want to negotiate for that higher salary, you might be awesome, but if you're locked away and no one knows what you're doing, being able to work out in the open is a great way of just personal development.
Totally. And I mean, it's a double-edged sword for hiring managers, because, having people that are out in networking in these communities and building their own personal eminence in open source communities can essentially make them very, good targets for, the competition to pick them up, and that can advance your career. But I think most developers, that's a nice thing if they get into a bind. But I think people like to work for a company that allows them to work in open source, right? I know a lot of the people on our team feel that way very strongly. And there's an awful lot of people that are on the product teams that really want to be on our team, because they'd love to be working out in open source. And so we're trying to sort of turn the tide and dial it up a notch to get more and more of the IBM developers that are working on proprietary products to work out in open source as well.
Yeah. I'm good.
Yeah, I can hear you great, Joe.
Good. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like there are so many benefits to being an open source. I think one thing, and forgive me if you guys already touched on this, but like learning to work with other people in open source in a collaborative way where, no manager is telling you whatever, but you have to figure it out with other people out in the open and make it work is a really important skill as well.
That's right. I mean, it's the what they call soft skills, right? That you learn from working out collaboratively in the open. You're learning to essentially be able to assert yourself in a positive way, right? To get your point across and so forth, and that helps. And then, of course, there's the practices that we have out in the open source communities tend to be a little bit more mature, especially from more advanced CI/CD type, agile development practices and so forth. And bringing that back into the enterprise is an important part of the overall, I think, attraction. The other thing that I didn't mention about the study was, it's 2/3 of developers and, more than 50% of developers about, thinking that it advanced their careers. The interesting thing that I found, though, was that when you look at who's responding, the hiring managers actually felt more strongly about both points by about 5%, which was, for me, I thought it was fascinating to see that the hiring managers are starting to recognize that this is important, right? And, increasingly we're getting a lot of our clients are asking us, we're getting an awful lot of our developers are asking us, can we work out in open source? And we don't know how to do that. So a lot of what I do is help some of our customers to work on how to incorporate, sort of open source into their thinking, into their practices.
Yeah, that's a really good segue, because I wanted to talk to you more about, I guess briefly, because this could be a whole episode, like how we do that internally, and then how do we kind of share that knowledge and what we're doing with our clients, something I've kind of bumped into as well.
Yeah, I mean, we actually published sort of the framework, if you will, that we use to encourage more and more open source. So we have, sort of annual training to start with, right? Just, what is open source and why should you care? And, you have to be careful. You don't want to just sort of pick up anything off the ground and use it. You want to make sure that you're using something that has a community behind it that's, working to, keep it current, to fix bugs and vulnerabilities as they arise and so forth. And, we teach them about all the different licenses and so forth. And then we also have some internal training. We call it the dojo, right? So it's basically an opportunity for people such as yourself, Joe, and others to basically help mentor new, developers that want to get involved in open source, and, help them through that process. First of, giving them the basic training, if you will, of working out in GitHub and how to land a pull request and how not to be a jerk in the chat forums and stuff like that. And but then also, when they get stuck and they're trying to get something in, we actually have a lot of people in a lot of the communities that can actually help sort of, get somebody up to speed and onboarded and feeling part of the community. So we have, we have all of that. And then we have like a recognition program every year. We go around and people that are actually leading in the various communities, we can recognize that value. We got badges. Everybody's got badges now, but we got badges, and so basically we're and then the other piece of it is that we're actually trying to, again, as I mentioned, we're trying to grow the upstream participation from the product teams. Way back in the day, I remember there was oh my God, you can't be contaminated by open source.
Unsafe
or something, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I always felt that was funny because if you look inside, peel the onion skin back a little bit, our flagship web application developer, WebSphere, web application development platform, was 70% open source. Right? So okay, so you can't touch open source. Tell me again. How does that work, right? So,
yeah,
and that was, that isn't the only one, and certainly all of the new stuff that we're doing now, all the cloud, AI and data, all of that is based on open. Even quantum, right? Is you've got Qiskit and Chasm out there, and very much out in the open. So and it pervades every single industry, and we're now starting to see more and more application level stuff is turning open source, right? So I was just working with a colleague who's in the oil and gas industry, and they've done this amazing work around open sourcing, if you will, a data analytics platform for oil and gas discovery, right? So it's some cool stuff. It's some cool stuff.
Yeah, I remember being at a conference and somebody coming up and talking to me about open source, and they're trying to get their employer, which was they worked in the auto industry, and they're like, very protective and afraid of any security related stuff. But I remember talking to them about keep the stuff that the business differentiators, those you can keep to yourself, but all the foundational stuff, build it out in the open with your competitors and help, crowdsource the work part of it. Right. And then, and also help work on security stuff together and work it all out in the open.
I every time I hear Chris had said in the open earlier, I was like, oh, he said in the open. Also in the open source coming from IBM and oil and gas industry, the MQTT standard from Andy Stanford Clark over there in Hursley is also another great example.
Yeah, it's also a good example of sort of the pairing, if you will, of open source and open standards, right? Because MQTT actually started as an open standard, and then there's a number of different implementations that have mostly been written in open source. So it's been a good partnership, really.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we talked a little bit about the Linux Foundation earlier, and I think it's really interesting that the Linux Foundation has become something of an umbrella foundation for all these other foundations. I'm a part of the OpenJS Foundation, and that was born out of merging the JS Foundation and the Node.js Foundation together, which all of them are Linux Foundation projects. I know a fairly recent one is the Open Source Security Foundation.
Yeah.
And you do some work in that space as well, Chris?
I do. Yeah. We back in right before the pandemic, about I want to say in the fourth quarter of 2019. IBM and Google and Microsoft and GitHub and Red Hat started to talk about the need to, and this predates the whole, SolarWinds thing. But we recognize that, look, open source is increasingly becoming sort of de facto in every industry, and whether it's governments or whether it's enterprise. It's pervading absolutely everything. And we need to make sure that we aren't going to be in a situation where, because we're taking dependencies of some obscure library someplace that nobody's paying attention to, that we end up with some serious vulnerability that causes, the world economies to collapse and stuff like that, right? So, so we had some conversations around, so how would we deal with this, right? And the thinking ranging from, well, let's, fund open source projects that are, needing, people to come and contribute to them. But then there's also like, but how can we help projects that are, that have diverse communities, but how can we help them improve the practices around secure engineering and developing an effective CI/CD system that isn't going to get compromised? And, how do we ensure that they have the wherewithal to be able to deal with vulnerabilities in a progressive disclosure kind of a way, right? Where you're not just sort of blurting out, hey, I got a 0 day in my in this cool library, right? And so there's a number of different aspects of this. Some of it is just sort of, again, badging, right? But we have the Core Infrastructure Initiative had a badging initiative that you could sort of assess your open source project against a set of best practices in the industry to ensure, and then you could get a little badge that you could put on your README that said, hey, I've got a CII badge. And now we have different levels of, passing silver and gold, I think, are the different levels, but they're progressively more and more focused on ensuring that you're able to deal with security vulnerabilities in a reasonable and responsible way. So yeah, I helped to actually work with Microsoft and Google in helping to set up the OpenSSF, and I serve on the board right now, and we're in the process now. Again, because we stood it up during the middle of the pandemic, when everybody was a little bit concerned about whether we were going to be in business the next week or not. We ended up saying, well, let's not go and dialing for dollars for millions of dollars funding right away. Let's get something going, and then we'll figure out how to fund it later. So we're actually in the process now of trying to figure out how do we turn it into, just as with the JS Foundation and so forth, how do we actually get it up and running with staff, with marketing dollars behind it, with full support for any of the operational aspects of things we want to do to make sure we have somebody out there essentially raising awareness of what we're trying to accomplish. With with SolarWinds and with some of the recent sort of ransomware hacks that have occurred, and Colonial Pipeline and others, and with the executive order most recently from the White House, everybody's hair is on fire now about the supply chain for open source security. Mm-hmm. And so we're getting a lot of attention. I think that's a positive thing, but I like the fact that we were sort of ahead of the curve and trying to get something rolling before everything hit the fan, so to speak.
So interesting. And two thoughts I wanted to mention here. On a past episode of the IBM Developer Podcast, we had the NSA community team come on, and they mentioned, using Eclipse and using a lot of open source tools, and that they, obviously there's a lot of strict controls when you get into these sorts of government agencies, but that they had work groups to be able to work on that stuff together. And then most recently, I just saw a post they made especially because of these nation state threats and infrastructure threats, they've actually created a like almost similar to like what our IBM garage is, to work with industry partners to be able to have a space where it's like the government and this space can work together in this kind of like co-working,
right,
half inside, half outside environment to address some of these threats.
Yeah, that was one of the things that we were trying to set up. Of course, we need some funding for that, so that's going to come. But we wanted to actually set up an enclave where we could collaborate together on resolving some critical vulnerabilities, whether it's in the kernel or elsewhere, in an environment where we had full build capabilities and everything, but nobody could see it except the people that had been granted access to it. But that would allow us, because right now everybody's doing it on their own pretty much, right? I mean, when we had the situation with Heartbleed and so forth, everybody had to go and deal with how to resolve that vulnerability on their own, right? It wasn't pretty. Everybody was doing the same piece of work essentially, but because we didn't have that ability to collaborate out in the open on that kind of, I mean, we were talking about it, right? But we weren't able to sort of actually collaborate on the actual fix in the open. So
one of, sorry to cut you off, Joe, but if I don't cut you off, you're going to cut me off.
That's what we do.
This is the New York way. So, one thing I was just going to mention, one of my favorite podcasts I listen to is called Darknet Diaries, and it talks about a lot of these cases, and it's exactly one of the things you mentioned. It's like, what if a security firm finds that 0 day? Now, of course, they want to tell their clients first, but they want to tell everybody else. Maybe someone else is discovering it at the same time, and then if you do release it, most of those systems are going to take a while to get updated and patched. Right. So sometimes, even doing the right thing and letting the community know about this vulnerability, those bad actors will within a day or two whip up something to exploit that and cause a huge problem in a very short period of time. It's a tough situation.
It really is. And that's actually one of the things, is getting into a best practice for how to set up a responsible disclosure process for reporting vulnerabilities that you uncover. Yeah, and the vast majority of open source projects don't have that level of maturity of having, sort of an inner sanctum, if you will, of security engineers who can deal with that sort of thing. But where you don't just blurt it onto the mailing list, but you instead send it to a mail address that's going only to the select individuals that have the ability to address the problem.
Yeah, and that's one of the benefits of being in a foundation, right? Is they help you to try to sort those things out and everything.
Yeah, I say most of open, but again, most of open source is, I like to say, most of open source is kind of random.
Yeah.
It's the projects that are housed in the likes of the LF or Apache or Eclipse that I think are the ones that have the most maturity. They also have the most prospects for sustained success, right? There's actually been studies done that projects under open governance tend to do better by and large than their non-openly governed counterparts. You can have projects that are controlled by a single vendor that are done very effectively. I mean, look, Google is not, you shouldn't shake your head at projects like, Istio and Knative. They're very well run, right? Would we like them to be under open governance? Yes, absolutely. And we're working towards that, but that's not necessarily the case. I mean, there's a lot of open source. It's just some guy came up with gal came up with a really good idea, wrote some software, and then they got busy with their day job, or they went back to school, or whatever it was. And there it is, right? It's like, hey, it's open source. You can have it, and you can.
Now billions of projects.
It's kind of like furniture left by the side of the road, right? You get this, you can have the couch, you can put it in your living room, but you get all the quarters and you get all the bugs.
Yeah. There's an XKCD comic where it's the Jenga sort of Lego things styled up, and there's a little one down here. Yeah, it's so true.
Yeah. That was on our the OpenSSF. That was one of the things we had in our announcement. We had that little XKCD thing. Yeah.
It's perfect. And we can move on in a second. I just wanted to share, and we can talk about this actually offline. But I have a friend, an old friend at the Ford Foundation, who I know from like punk rock days, and she spoke at OpenJS World recently. And anyway, we're talking about trying to get a grant from them and work with them at the LF. And I think security would be a really interesting thing to explore. So let's maybe talk about that more offline. I'm curious, what are some of the things that you're excited about right now? You know, in the work that you're doing, or research, or whatever.
So. Very recently, one of my colleagues who was managing, so we have an open tech group. The open tech group is sort of split down the middle, where half of the team is working on sort of cloud and cloud native kind of things, and the other half is working on data and AI. And so my colleague is retiring after a long career. And so I took over the data and AI side of things, saying, okay, I've never been a manager, but let's give this a try. But over the course of I would say like the past year, I've started shifting a lot of my focus. I had been working on blockchain, right, for a while. And so I started shifting a lot of my focus to data and AI. I think it's fascinating. I taught myself Python and learned a lot about the different frameworks and so forth. And so that's sort of the world that I'm in most now, right? If you will, still keep a sharp eye on some of the other things, but and the other part of my job is, as an IBM fellow, I have to have sort of more of a global influence and so forth. And I've been, as I mentioned, I'm trying to sort of get the IBM company to be thinking about open source first. And so I actually have this initiative that we call the Open Source First Initiative, where I'm trying to get people to say, rather than the first instinct to be, let's develop something proprietary when we need some new capability, let's look at open source first. If there's something there, then let's see if that makes sense for us, and let's turn that equation on its head. And so I'm also working to try and get more and more things to be either put out as open source, because I don't see a reason why we have to keep things proprietary, as well as getting them to start looking first at what's already existent in open source. And so one of the teams that I've been working with is in research. And they recently published something that's actually not open source, but open data. It's actually also an open source project called CodeNet. Basically what they have is they have a curated data set of software that was entered into various contests. So it's been vetted, right? It's been reviewed thoroughly, and so they know that the software is doing what it's supposed to do. And so they've been doing machine learning on that foundation, that data set of vetted software. And they're hoping that they can leverage that to actually, whether it's to make recommendations as to, I see you're trying to write a loop, maybe you should do it this way as opposed to what you're doing, right? That kind of thing. To give recommendations in an IDE, for instance, as to how better to write something, to spot potential vulnerabilities before they actually reach the merge state. So when you're doing development, they can actually say, you're going to create a vulnerability here. So they put this out. It's gotten an awful lot of attention, but the other thing that it's done is it's really sort of helped to see the value of taking something that we've done that's really cool and putting it out there, because now we're getting a whole lot of credit in the machine learning space for, hey, that's really, really cool stuff, And so even some of our competitors are taking advantage of that data set, and people are starting to write models around it. We'll be doing some and publishing those as well, but it really has sort of helped the executives in research and elsewhere in IBM recognize the value of doing that, right? We had a similar success, right, with blockchain when we open sourced the IBM blockchain. We called it IBM Open Blockchain. We contributed that to Hyperledger, which I actually created as well, and created the Hyperledger Fabric project out of that. But there was a huge success, right, from an open source perspective, and it led to hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue for IBM in building services around that foundation. But it wouldn't have happened if we had been proprietary about it. It just couldn't have.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Oh, am I getting an echo again? Dang it. Go ahead, Luke.
I didn't hear it, but
yeah, I can hear it.
Oh, okay.
That is fascinating. And I have some I didn't realize you had worked on the Hyperledger and the blockchain stuff. I have some questions offline to ask you. I've been thinking about stuff, so I'm gonna make a note to myself to come back to that. But yeah, and I could see how you were mentioning that vulnerabilities. This could be really useful to tie into the last topic we were talking about. Things that would be, I'm imagining a lot of these things, indiscernible for a human, or it takes a lot of time for a human to discern it. But if you're able to maybe look at past exploits, past vulnerabilities, and then use AI to inform automation on looking for new ones.
Right. I mean, right now, everything is basically pattern matching. So we're looking for exact matches, the signature, if you will, of a particular vulnerability. This is actually looking at, where does something have that potential? Because a lot of vulnerabilities actually happen not because there's a piece of code that's flawed, but it's because then you lay it on top of a piece of hardware and then it opens up some new, boom, and so there's an awful lot of things that don't necessarily get caught right away just from the scanning that we have today.
I was reading a little bit about the CodeNet, and one of the things that I got excited about was, and you were saying, or the documentation said it part of it is because it has such good commenting and metadata around the code base, so that now it becomes it's not beyond that simple pattern matching. You can almost get into a semantic ontology of how the code works.
Right. I mean, if you just did machine learning on like all of GitHub, right, which I guess maybe somebody could do, but how much of that code is really good versus so you don't want, it's kind of like you don't want to have the bias of really bad software practices to creep into your AI that's going to help make recommendations as to how you should write something. So this is actually, like I said, it's been vetted code. It was code that was contributed into competitions. And so it's well documented, it's well, structured, well written, because of all of that. And that's what makes it different than just random code.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You got my audio, right? We're good?
You're good.
Yep, we're good.
Yeah, and I, just a quick aside, and again, we can talk about this more offline, but my colleague over in the OpenJS Foundation, Mike Samuel, is looking at like translation stuff through IDEs too for, different locations and pre-fluent, he was calling folks who might use this. I wonder if some of that could be useful there too. So I'll try to connect some dots there.
There's actually also a Red Hat project. Oh my God, I'm going to get the name wrong. Oh, I should have thought of this before.
We'll edit it in post-production.
Yeah, but it actually is doing that sort of recommender level stuff, right? And so we've been talking between the two teams about how do we sort of get my chocolate in your peanut butter kind of thing.
Yeah. So. Where, as usual, the hour flies by really fast. I know there are a few other things that we wanted to touch on. One of them, I think we're hoping would be public by now, but is maybe we're still.
Oh, yeah. So, one of the things that we, obviously that we do is we keep an eye on what's going on out in, the open source world, if you will. And there's a project that sort of caught a lot of people's attention, Project Ray. It's being developed by some of the same people that developed Spark. And so, we've been taking a very close look at it. It does some very interesting things. Python is not, trying to do like multi-threaded Python is difficult, right? And so anytime you want to do some machine learning, and in this particular case, it's reinforcement learning, that Ray was built for. You want to run a whole bunch of things in parallel. Otherwise, it's just going to take you forever to do, to train a model. And so they've written capabilities that allow you essentially to annotate your Python and or Java and have it run off and do things in parallel in separate containers and stuff. So this is interesting for a variety of reasons, but basically it can help accelerate the process of training models and so forth. So that's interesting enough, and that got the attention of a lot of the data scientists and so forth that are working on things like Cloud Pak for Data, people that are working in research and so forth. But it also caught the attention of the people that are doing serverless work. And we have a project called Code Engine, which does serverless. And so somebody had the brilliant idea of what if we layered Ray on top of Code Engine, right? So that we could actually sort of fire off different threads in a serverless kind of a manner that would also then be parallelized. And so we could actually sort of get even better, we call them pipelines. And so we actually presented something at the Ray Summit this past week. I was actually hoping it would be announced yesterday, but I guess the actual announcement is going to be maybe after the fourth weekend. But watch this space, as they say.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting capabilities published as open source again. Right? This is again, it's the accelerating trend here from IBM. Especially because we want to be able to collaborate with our colleagues over at Red Hat, and everything they do is upstream. So that's the pattern that we're starting to see more and more of. And I couldn't be happier. It took me 20 years to get here, but it's a good thing.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I'll encourage folks to follow you on Twitter to hear more about that in the coming weeks.
We'll be talking about that probably in another week or so.
Yeah, exciting.
And we'll definitely mention it when in an upcoming episode in our introduction, and we'll add it to the show notes of this episode.
Yeah, and then I would actually encourage. I'll connect with you guys afterwards, but it'd be good probably to have a chat with some of the guys that are working on this. I think it would be.
Would love to. Yeah, that would be great. Really great. Yeah. Very cool. Yeah. What else? I know we had a bunch of other things we want to.
How about this? The new data license agreement.
Oh yeah, I meant to mention that with the Code Network. So we'd actually, oh God, when was it? About a year ago, I guess. We've been collaborating with Microsoft and the Linux Foundation and a few others on, we needed to have an ability to license data, right? It's not open source, so it has, there's different things to be concerned about. And you want to be able to license data for particular uses and so forth. So we came up with something we call the Community Data License Agreement, or the CDLA. It had a couple, had a sort of a sharing mode, and it had a permissive mode. And the permissive mode was considered to be a little bit cumbersome, let's say, of a license. And so colleagues of mine and folk from, Microsoft and Linux Foundation, again, got together and said, well, we need to solve that problem. Because we really want to be able to publish data sets for machine learning and so forth that are, fully permissive. So we wanted to have something equivalent of like the MIT license for data, right? It's essentially what we're looking for. So we actually came up with and just announced it this, I guess it was about a week ago, the CDLA permissive version 2, which does exactly that. It gets us to a much cleaner and less cumbersome permissive license for the CDLA. And so we actually, one of the first things that we've published under the CDLA permissive v2 is the CodeNet dataset.
Cool.
And there will be more coming. We actually we actually have something called the Data Asset Exchange. And so we're in the process now of working with research and legal to sort of get all of those that are written under the old CDLA 1 permissive to adopt the CDLA 2 permissive.
Yeah, this is amazing and fascinating to me. Like, this is what I love about open source, right? It's like, we have this problem, you have this problem. Let's get together, talk about it, solve it together, totally. and everybody benefits. Right. I think it's
we're competing in the AI space, right? Obviously, Microsoft or but we're trying to get to a point where at the end of the day, there's so much that's really just table stakes, right? There's so much software that's basically just commodity capability, doesn't really differentiate. And I think most software vendors are now realizing that there's really no value in trying to come up with, a better version than somebody else, because it'll just, the community is just going to out innovate you eventually, right? You may have a brief advantage for a time, but then the community will come along and do it for you anyway.
Yeah, that's so true.
I was going to say, and it's like, what are we selling? Aluminum siding? Like, Total War isn't going to benefit anybody, and it's better we put that energy on actual that differentiating value for all of our customers, right? And if we grow it like this, there's plenty of room and business for everybody, and we get the value from the value we actually create for our customers, or the profit from that value.
Yeah.
That's right. And the value isn't in the differentiation; it's in the solutions and the services and the support that you can provide. That's the real value, right? I mean, that's the end of the day, from my perspective, that's the real value of software, is in the support and services.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know if this is a good segue, but another thing we had talked about in the prep show was the LinuxOne build platform for the open source project stuff.
Oh, right, yeah. So that's actually another cool thing. And just very briefly, a lot of projects, the Linux team, the LinuxOne team, I should say, the Z Linux team, they're trying to make open source more compatible with the mainframe platform. A lot of people think, oh, the mainframe, that's like 1980s technology.
Yeah.
I got news for you. We got some capabilities in the mainframe that'll blow your mind.
Yeah.
And we've got full Linux capabilities on the mainframe as well. And so, but they're it's, again, we have to do there's always some porting that's involved, right? And so it used to be the case, and it still is the case to a certain degree, that when we have customers that say, I want to run Cassandra on Z Linux, we have to do a little bit of porting, and we have to do some maintenance to keep it patched and so forth. And the preference would really be, well, why aren't we just making the LinuxOne capabilities available in the cloud for people that are working in open source to use as a resource, the same way that, for instance, Intel did back in the day with CNCF, and said, here's 1,000 boxen that you can use to scale and performance test Kubernetes and so forth. And so we're in the process of making a build platform available for open source, trying to publicize it and get other projects to recognize it. You can just extend your Travis. If you're using Travis, for instance, to do your CI/CD, you can just extend it into this and have a build pop out the other end to make sure that it's going to run on Z Linux, right? And then they'll help with remediation of any issues that you might run into. But the first step is really just making that build platform available to people to use. So that's another, I think, a positive step that we've taken.
Yeah. That's great. I gotta make sure. I assume my colleagues on the Node.js space are fully aware of this, but I'm gonna touch base with them after this call. Awesome stuff.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chris, for taking the time to chat with us today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. This was fun. Yeah. This was good.
And as Joe mentioned, the hour just flies by. But again, if anybody has any questions that there was some chat coming through, I didn't pass anything through, but if you're catching this on podcast, please feel free to check the show notes and private message us.
Tweet at us or DM us or whatever. Yeah, exactly. Yep. always happy to answer questions.
Yep. Great. Well, thanks, Chris. I really appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Joe. Thanks, Luke. Appreciate the time. This was good.
Yeah.
A lot of fun.
Definitely
You guys have a nice weekend.
Yep. You too.
You too.
Cheers.
Take care.